If you stood on the docks of Itajaí in southern Brazil recently, you would have witnessed a sight that felt less like a standard shipment and more like a silent electric tidal wave. A massive cargo ship, not a run-in vessel, but one owned entirely by the manufacturer BYD, lowered its ramps to disgorge over 7,000 electric vehicles onto the pavement in one go. It was efficient, it was gleaming, and for the traditional titans of the South American auto industry, it was deeply unsettling. For decades, there was a predictable, comfortable rhythm to the Brazilian car market. It was a regional marriage of convenience with Argentina. Parts flowed across the border, finished cars came back, and the two neighbors kept the Mercosur engine humming in a reliable, insular loop. Argentina was the undisputed king of imports, the partner everyone assumed would always hold the keys to the local showrooms. But this January, that decades-long partnership hit a brick wall. The latest data reveals a sudden, sharp reversal that has left industry veterans stunned. China didn't just enter the race, it lapped the field, officially surpassing Argentina to become Brazil's largest vehicle exporter. We aren't talking about a minor statistical flicker either. The value of Chinese car imports has surged to 10 times what it was only a year ago, now claiming a staggering 65% of the entire import market. The real twist, however, isn't just the sheer volume, it's the how. While Argentine cars are built using a complex web of local Brazilian parts, these Chinese arrivals often show up fully baked, bypassing the local supply chain almost entirely. It has left Brazil's main car makers association, Anfavea, watching production numbers slip and sounding the alarm on a model that brings plenty of cars, but very few local jobs. It raises a haunting question. Is this the inevitable evolution of the Brazilian road, or is the country's industrial backbone being quietly dismantled, one shipping container at a time? That opening, it really does paint a pretty stark picture, doesn't it?
It does. It feels like you're watching history happen in, slow motion, but also incredibly fast at the same time.
Exactly. It's February 12th, 2026. We're looking at the data that just came out for January. And what we're seeing isn't just a sales spike. It feels like a complete changing of the guard. So I think the mission for this deep dive has to be getting underneath that headline. We really need to understand how this happens so incredibly fast.
Yeah.
We're talking about a lightning fast displacement of traditional powers, specifically Argentina, by a level of Chinese efficiency and technology that South America has just never seen before.
It's absolutely a historic moment. And to your point about the speed, that's what makes it so fascinating. Usually these kinds of industrial shifts, they take decades to play out. This one feels like it happened overnight.
Right.
But if we peel back the layers, and that's what we're going to do, you see it's not just about selling cars, it's a complete logistical and industrial overhaul. We're going to be looking at how manufacturers like BYD and Great Wall Motor GWM are basically rewriting the rules of the Mercosur trade bloc.
Rewriting the rules completely.
They're leveraging these very specific manufacturing techniques, which we'll get into, and they're using these, just deep capital reserves to jumpstart an electric revolution that, frankly, local economics just couldn't support on their own.
Yeah, that's the thing, because the easy narrative is just China sells cheap cars.
Yeah.
But that is way too simplistic here. If you really dig in, this is a story about logistics. It's a story about navigating tariffs. Maybe tariff optimization is the polite way to put it. And it's a story about finance. So I want to start where the cars actually land. I want to take you to the docks. I was reading this really vivid account from a dock supervisor, a guy named Mateo at the Port of Santos. Now, Mateo has been working these docks for 30 years.
30 years? After 30 years on the docks, you develop a feel for the rhythm of global trade. You know who's buying, who's selling, just by the logos on the containers.
And for decades, Mateo's life was dictated by what he called the Mercosur pulse. It was this steady, predictable heartbeat. He'd see ships coming up from Argentina, loaded with parts, finished vehicles from the big players, Ford, VW, GM, Fiat.
The usual suspects.
The usual suspects. It was a back and forth. Brazil sends parts down. Argentina sends finished cars back up. It was this perfect closed loop.
But lately, Mateo says the horizon just looks completely different. He describes the arrival of this one ship, a ship called the Explorer No. 1. And I think we really need to pause on this because the way he talks about it, it's not just another boat.
Not. The Explorer No. 1 is a statement of intent. In the logistics world, this is a massive, massive differentiator.
Yeah.
Most car companies, even the huge ones, they rely on third-party shippers.
Right. They rent space. They call up Maersk or Wallenius Wilhelmsen, they book a slot on a massive roll-on, roll-off vessel, and they are completely at the mercy of global shipping rates. If the price of a container goes up, their margins get squeezed. If there's a traffic jam at the Panama Canal, their entire inventory is just stuck at sea.
But BYD didn't rent this ship.
No, that's the game changer. They built it. They own it. The Explorer No. is owned and operated by BYD. This is what we mean when we talk about vertical integration, but it's extending out into the ocean. It creates this totally self-contained ecosystem. So while all the traditional players are, haggling over shipping contracts and dealing with all the friction of South American logistics, the paperwork, the delays, BYD has what you could almost call logistical sovereignty.
Logistical sovereignty.
Yeah.
So they control the entire timeline.
They control the timeline, they control the cost structure, they control the route. Matteo describes watching this ship lower its ramp, and he saw over 3,000 EVs just roll off in a single afternoon.
3,000.
3,000. He said in his report that handling that kind of volume from Argentina used to take weeks of coordination. You have to imagine the endless paperwork, the customs checks, trying to coordinate multiple smaller vessels. Here, it's one single, massive, silent delivery. It's like a shock and awe campaign, but in logistics form.
And this brings us right to the bigger picture, right? The death of the regional loop. We touched on it in the intro, but I want to really drill down into why this is such a profound disruption. For years, you had this marriage of convenience between Argentina and Brazil. Can you kind of explain how that actually worked on the ground? Why was Argentina the undisputed king?
Yeah, it all goes back to the design of the Mercosur bloc itself. The whole idea was to create a protected industrial zone, a walled garden, like you said. Brazil has this massive consumer market and a pretty good auto parts manufacturing base. Argentina has a really strong history of vehicle assembly. So they created a system where they protected each other with high tariffs against the rest of the world. If you're Ford, for example, you build the engine in your Brazilian plant, you ship it to your Argentine plant, you put it in a Ranger pickup truck, and then you ship that finished truck back to Brazil, and you pay basically zero import tax. Perfectly symbiotic. And that's what made Argentina so dominant, because the huge Brazilian market needed those Argentine factories to keep the local dealerships stocked with cars.
It's a walled garden. And everyone inside the garden was happy because they didn't really have to compete with the outside world. It was safe.
Exactly. It was comfortable. It was predictable. Also, and that is what the January 2026 data shows us in brutal detail. That comfort zone has been completely obliterated.
Yeah.
The numbers are stark. China sent 16,800 units to Brazil in January. Argentina sent 13,400. Now, on the surface, that might not sound like a huge gap, but symbolically, it is an earthquake. It's the first time that the primary partner has been outsold by an outsider.
And the value difference is even crazier. But $375 million in import value from China in 1 month.
A tenfold increase from the year before.
10 times.
And that value surge tells you something really important. They are not just selling cheap, basic cars. They're selling high-value technology, electric vehicles, hybrids, packed with features. But let's go back to the how. The reason the Mercosur model is failing to stop this is that the Chinese model just bypasses all the friction. Well, the old Mercosur model relies on that slow back-and-forth movement of parts across borders. It's bureaucratic. It has these local content rules where you have to prove a certain percentage of the car was actually made in South America to avoid the big taxes.
So it's designed to be slow, in a way, and protect jobs.
The Chinese firms, for now, are just shipping fully baked cars. They're paying the current import tax, sure, but they are bypassing the entire local supply chain. So while the Brazilian and Argentine governments are in meetings debating trade rules and quotas,
BYD is just sailing a ship right past the meeting room and unloading 7,000 cars.
Yes. The traditional model is completely bogged down in legacy infrastructure and decades of bureaucracy. The Chinese model is streamlined to an incredible degree. From the lithium mine in China to the factory in Shenzhen onto the Explorer No. and straight to the dock in Santos, it is one continuous controlled line. They have deleted the middleman.
And in this case, the middleman was the entire country of Argentina's auto industry.
That is the brutal reality of it. It's an efficiency machine running right over a decades-old diplomatic agreement.
Incredible. But here's the thing that I keep coming back to. You can't just import cars forever, can you? I mean, Brazil has a long history of protectionism. At some point, the government is going to step in and say, hey, stop dumping finished cars here and start building factories, start creating jobs.
This brings us to the next phase of this whole operation. The ships are the tip of the spear, but the factories are the occupation.
Right. And to understand this part, we've got another perspective. I was reading about an engineer, a woman named Elena. She works in a town called Erasimopolis. Now, for car people, Erasimopolis is kind of a famous spot. It used to be a high-end Mercedes-Benz plant.
Top of the line. German engineering, precision.
But Mercedes left, they pulled out, they just couldn't make the math work in Brazil. And now that same plant is owned by Great Wall Motor, GWM. And Elena, this engineer, she describes the atmosphere there as calculated haste.
Calculated haste. That is a perfect description of the Chinese industrial approach, especially in the global south.
She says they aren't waiting around to build a full foundry from scratch. They're not building a massive stamping plant where they turn giant rolls of raw steel into car doors. Not yet, anyway. She sees these huge crates arriving with car bodies that are already welded together. The battery packs are already fully assembled. Her team is basically doing what she calls surgical integration.
Like a high-tech assembly line?
Exactly. They're just putting the big pieces together. She calls it a puzzle piece strategy. Now, to me, this sounds a little bit like, I don't know, cheating, or at least taking a major shortcut. What is actually happening here technically?
It's not cheating, but it is 100% a loophole, and a brilliant one at that. What Elena is describing is something called SKD, that stands for semi-knockdown assembly.
SKD.
In a traditional factory, what we call CKD, or complete knockdown, you are doing everything on site. You're welding thousands of spot welds on the frame, you're painting the raw metal body, you might even be casting the engine block. Setting that up costs billions of dollars and takes years.
Okay, so that's the old way.
SKD is totally different. The car is almost entirely built in China. Then they take it apart just enough to fit it into a shipping crate and to legally classify it as unassembled. Maybe they take the wheels off, they disconnect the main battery, they separate the chassis from the drivetrain.
So it's basically a very expensive, very heavy Lego set.
And then they ship that Lego set to Erasimopolis, and Elena's team snaps it all back together. But the key question is why? Why go to all this trouble? Why not just keep shipping the finished cars? It's because of what you mentioned earlier, the tariff clock. This is the stick that the Brazilian government is now wielding.
This is the mover program.
Yeah.
I looked into this. Brazil basically drew a line in the sand and said, the party of zero tax imports is over. If you want to sell cars here, you have to build them here.
Exactly. And the timeline here explains the calculated haste Elena described. Back in 2015, the tariff on imported EVs was zero. It was a complete tax holiday to encourage adoption. But the government realized this wasn't actually creating any local jobs. So in January 2024, they slapped a 10% tariff on imports. Just 6 months later, in July 2024, it jumped to 18%. And right now, as we speak, that clock is ticking towards July of 2026, when the tariff hits a punishing 35%.
35%. That's a death blow for an importer.
It completely destroys your price advantage. If you're importing a fully built car, that 35% tax makes you uncompetitive overnight. So SKD is the bridge. Correct. By doing this puzzle piece assembly in Erasimopolis, GWM can legally claim Made in Brazil status. They get to bypass those high import tariffs immediately. It allows them to keep the price low for the consumer while they buy themselves time, maybe a year or two, to build the actual heavy-duty factory.
It's a strategic hedge.
It's the ultimate strategic hedge. They don't have to risk $1 billion on day one on a factory that might fail. They test the market with imports, then they switch to SKD to beat the tax clock, and then, only when they are certain the volume is there, do they commit to full manufacturing.
It's just incredibly smart. It's so nimble. It feels like Western companies usually have two modes. Commit fully for a 5-year project, or don't do it at all. They build the perfect factory, spend 3 years doing it, and by the time they open the doors, the market has completely changed.
Or they just leave, like Ford did.
And that's the other side of this whole story, the symbolism of the industrial graveyards. Elena is working in the old Mercedes plant, but BYD is doing the same thing at the massive Ford complex in Camaçari, in the state of Bahia. I mean, Ford was a pillar in Brazil for a century. Their exit in 2021 was a national trauma. It left thousands and thousands of people unemployed.
A ghost town.
A complete ghost town. And now BYD is walking into that same complex, investing 5.5 billion reais. That's over $1 billion US. And they're turning it into a state-of-the-art EV hub.
The symbolism of that just cannot be overstated. You have the retreat of the old Western industrial giants, Ford, Mercedes, who looked at Brazil and all they saw was red ink. They saw unprofitability, they saw labor issues, they saw logistical nightmares. And then you have the Chinese firms looking at the exact same empty buildings and seeing a launchpad.
It's a complete shift in industrial stewardship.
And on the jobs, question critics will say, and they're right, that SKD assembly doesn't create as many jobs as a full-scale factory. Assembling puzzle pieces takes fewer people than welding raw steel. But the projection is that eventually this whole ecosystem will create something like 20,000 jobs.
Which, is 20,000 more than zero, which is what Ford and Mercedes left behind.
Exactly. And they are actively countering that narrative that this is just a ghost assembly operation. They are putting real serious money into the ground. They are revitalizing these industrial graveyards. So you've got the ships controlling the logistics, and you've got the SKD strategy managing the politics and the taxes on the ground.
But there's a third piece of the puzzle, right? You've got the supply chain figured out, you've got the factory, but you still need someone to actually buy the car. And Brazil is a notoriously tough place to be a consumer, especially for a big ticket item. The interest rates are astronomical.
Yeah.
And that brings us to our third story, a guy named Ricardo.
Yes, let's talk about the reality for the consumer.
Ricardo is a small business owner in São Paulo. He runs a logistics fleet, delivery vans, that kind of thing. For years, he'd wanted to electrify his fleet. He knew it made sense on paper. Electricity is way cheaper than gasoline. There's less maintenance on the vehicles. But every single time he tried, he ran headfirst into the Custo Brazil.
The infamous Brazil cost. It's the catch-all term for the absolute nightmare of doing business there. It's the bureaucracy, it's the taxes, but more than anything, it's the cost of capital.
The loans. He goes to a normal Brazilian bank, and they offer him an interest rate that is just. It's insulting. We are talking 20, sometimes 30%, depending on the economic climate at the moment. The Selic rate, their benchmark interest rate, is kept historically high to fight inflation. So for a regular guy like Ricardo, buying a whole new fleet of cutting-edge technology was just impossible. The math didn't work.
And this is where the Chinese capital weapon comes into play. This is something Western companies very rarely do, at least not at this scale. Yeah. The Chinese manufacturers are effectively acting as their own banks. Well, a company like BYD or GWM, they have access to capital back in China that is much, much cheaper. They're state-backed or have access to state-backed loans. They view Brazil not just as a market for this quarter's profit report, but as a long-term strategic, even geopolitical capture. So they can afford to subsidize the financing for the end customer. Ricardo goes to a BYD dealership, and instead of being told to get a 25% loan from a local bank, maybe he gets a 5% or 8% loan subsidized directly by the automaker. They are undercutting the entire local banking system just to move the metal off the lot.
So they are essentially paying to get the cars on the road. They're willing to eat a loss on the loan in order to win the market share for the car itself.
It's a loss leader strategy, but on a massive macroeconomic scale. They are bridging that financing gap that the local Brazilian economy simply couldn't fix on its own. And it's not just the loans for the cars, it's the infrastructure too. Ricardo shared a picture of his new fleet. He bought a bunch of the Seagull, which is the BYD Dolphin Mini. And in the picture, they're all charging at a brand new charging station that literally did not exist 6 months ago.
And that's the classic chicken and egg problem, right? Nobody buys EVs because there are no chargers. And nobody builds chargers because there are no EVs.
Exactly. Brazil has maybe 5,000 public chargers in the entire country. To support a real EV transition, it needs more like 100,000. Legacy automakers, your GMs, your VWs, they tend to wait. They lobby the government to build the infrastructure. They say, we'll be happy to sell the cars once you build the grid for us.
Right.
The Chinese firms aren't waiting. They are building the chargers themselves. They are partnering with local energy companies. They are installing the hardware in shopping malls and on highways to ensure their product is actually usable. It's a level of vertical integration that includes the gas station, essentially.
Incredible. Let's talk about the car itself, though, the Dolphin Mini. Ricardo is driving these things every day. The price point is just wild. It's around $22,000 US, which is about 118,000 reais.
And to give that some context, the Chevy Bolt, which for a long time was the cheapest EV option from a U.S. company, was about $7,000 more expensive. In a developing market like Brazil, that is a massive, massive gap. $7,000 is a fortune. The Dolphin Mini basically democratized the EV in Brazil overnight. Before this, an electric car was a toy for the rich in the gated communities of São Paulo. Now, with the Dolphin Mini, it's a practical tool for a delivery driver.
But it's not just about being cheap. I think this is maybe the most clever part of their entire strategy. They didn't just show up and say, here's a battery-powered car, take it or leave it. They actually looked at what Brazilians currently drive. And Brazilians, they love ethanol.
This is the flex fuel strategy, and it is a masterclass in adaptability. Brazil has a gigantic sugarcane industry. As a result, something like 85% of the cars on the road can run on ethanol fuel. It's renewable, it's produced locally, it's usually cheaper than gas. If you try to force a pure EV-only solution on that market, you are fighting against the powerful agricultural lobby and decades of consumer habit. They introduced plug-in hybrids, PHEVs models like the BYD King and the Song Pro that are specifically designed to be flex fuel. They run on electricity for your daily commute, but the small combustion engine that serves as a backup, it runs on Brazilian ethanol.
Wow. So you get the electric driving for zipping around the city. But if you want to drive out into the countryside where there are zero chargers, you just fill up at any station with sugarcane fuel.
It completely kills range anxiety, which is a huge barrier to EV adoption. And maybe more importantly, it respects the local culture. It sends a message that says, we aren't here to replace your heritage, we're here to upgrade it. And that combination, respecting the ethanol legacy while introducing the electric future, is why they won the market so unbelievably fast. They grabbed 89% of the pure EV sales, sure, but they are also taking a huge chunk of the hybrid market because they were the ones who adapted.
And Ricardo mentioned one other small thing that I thought was so telling. The car speaks Portuguese.
Native Portuguese voice control, not some clunky translation. Fully localized apps. The big touchscreens are integrated with local services. It doesn't feel like a weird, cheap import where the GPS is always glitchy. It feels premium, and that just destroys the old lingering stigma that Chinese cars are cheap junk. Ricardo feels like he upgraded his business, not like he bought some discount product.
Here, we've got the ships dominating the ocean logistics. We've got the factories doing this SKD dance to beat the tariffs. We've got the financing and the perfectly adapted tech winning over the consumer on the ground. But what is the end game here? Because if I'm China, I can't just be happy selling cars to Brazil, right? This has to be part of something much bigger.
Brazil is not just the destination. Brazil is the launchpad. If we look at the geopolitical map, the ultimate goal here is to turn Brazil from an import market into an export hub for the entire global south.
An export hub.
Yeah.
So the idea is to use these new Brazilian factories to supply the rest of South America.
Everyone else. Remember the Mercosur, a trade bloc? We talked about how it was a closed loop, a walled garden. Well, once you are inside that loop, once your factory is officially producing cars in Bahia or Irasimopolis, you are, for all intents and purposes, a Brazilian company. You can then export duty-free to Uruguay, to Paraguay, to Colombia, and crucially, back to Argentina.
They first displaced Argentina as the primary supplier to Brazil, and now they're going to use Brazil as a base to supply cars to Argentina.
It's a complete inversion of the old trade route. The ships used to bring Argentine-made cars north to Brazil. Very soon, ships will be taking Brazilian-made, Chinese-branded cars south to Buenos Aires. China is methodically replacing the U.S. and Europe as the primary industrial partner for the entire continent.
And I've heard this term floating around, pit to product. Does that apply here in Brazil?
It absolutely applies, and this is the long-term vision. Brazil has significant deposits of lithium. It has the raw minerals you need for EV batteries. The ultimate vision, and this is why they are investing billions, not just millions, is to eventually mine and process the lithium in Brazil, manufacture the battery cells in the Camaçari plant, and then put those batteries into the cars being assembled right there.
A completely closed loop.
A completely self-sufficient closed loop within Brazil. This insulates their entire South American operation from global shipping costs, from geopolitical tensions, from future pandemics. If the Suez Canal closes or if there's a conflict in the South China Sea, the South American factory keeps humming along without interruption. It's essentially creating a backup hard drive for their global industrial capacity.
That is just a staggering level of foresight. It makes the Western response, or lack thereof, look non-existent.
The Western response has been hesitant at best. GM is investing, but they're very cautious. They're worried about quarterly profit margins. They're worried about shareholder returns next quarter. The Chinese firms are playing a decade-long game. They simply filled a vacuum. Western companies largely abandoned the affordable small car segment to focus on big, expensive trucks and SUVs. China saw that massive gap in the market and just flooded it with high-tech, affordable EVs and hybrids.
It really feels like the West was playing checkers, and China showed up to play 4D chess. But To be fair, is this actually bad for Brazil in the long run?
And that is the nuance we have to land on here. It's really easy to frame this as a hostile conquest. But if you look at it from the perspective of the Brazilian government or a Brazilian worker, this is a massive and maybe necessary modernization shock to their system. It is forcing their entire industrial base to upgrade. Whether the logo on the hood is American or Chinese, the fact is the factory in Bahia is now being filled with cutting-edge robotics. The local workers are being trained on how to handle high-voltage battery systems. The national grid is getting better, faster chargers.
It's an injection of 21st century technology into an industrial sector that was, frankly, getting rusty.
Exactly. You could call it a green leapfrog. Brazil is getting the infrastructure, the investment, and the capital it desperately needed to modernize its auto industry. It's just coming from a different partner than they or anyone else expected.
So let's bring it all back home. We started this deep dive on the docks with Mateo, watching that silent electric tidal wave pour out of the Explorer No. 1. We went into the factory with Elena, watching the puzzle pieces come together just in time to beat that tariff clock. And we ended up riding with Ricardo in his new Dolphin Mini, a car he could only afford because of a whole new system of finance and infrastructure.
It's a complete ecosystem takeover, from ship to shore, from factory to financing. And the speed of it all is the thing that just stays with me. In less than 2 years, the entire market didn't just shift, it completely flipped on its head.
Incredible, and I think that's the real takeaway for anyone listening. We often talk about the global south and developing nations trying to modernize, trying to catch up. Brazil is the test case. This is the new model. It shows how a country can potentially leapfrog into the green age if it's willing to swap its traditional industrial partners from the west for new ones from the east. That silent electric tidal wave we talked about at the start. Well, it has landed. And when you look at the factories rising up in the old Ford lots, you realize the tide is definitely not going back out.